Okay, good morning. It's, I guess, a significant day for us as the members of this year because today we're going to, please God, complete this chapter, chapter 3. So that makes halfway through Pirkei Avos, right? There's 6 chapters in total. So if we're finishing chapter 3, we're halfway. It's a big achievement. The only thing that's a little misleading about it is that each subsequent chapter is longer. So we might be chapter-wise halfway, but actual content-wise, we're not really yet halfway. That's good news, though. That means that there's plenty more that we could still learn. The final Mishnah of chapter 3 is very short. Not only is it very short, it tackles topics that not so simple to understand exactly what we're referring to. And our overriding question is going to be, what's the thread that runs through this Mishnah? Because it appears that there are a whole lot of disconnected parts that somehow all comprise a single message. So we've got to understand exactly what that's all about. Before we can do that, let's start by learning who is the person that we are learning about in this Mishnah. Who's the rabbi in this Mishnah? Okay, that's where we're going to start. Now, when I put the text up on the screen, you're going to see that there are 2 versions of how we refer to this particular rabbi. And to illustrate those 2 versions, there's a word that's going to appear in parentheses, and that's the word ben. Now, usually when rabbis are introduced to us, it's introduced as so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. Right? It's very common. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, etc. It's very common. Thing is that sometimes when it uses the word ben, actually it doesn't mean son of. Did you know that? Sometimes it means that a person had a particular characteristic or a particular trait. And that's not only in the Mishnah. You actually find that in the Torah as well. So for example, Kalev ben Yefuneh. So there's one opinion in the Gemara that says his father's name was not Yefuneh, but Yefuneh comes from the word poine, which means to turn aside. Because Kalev turned aside and did not follow the spies at the time of the debacle of the spies, because he turned away, so he's called Ben Yefuneh. The person has the trait of turning aside from what everybody else was doing. Likewise, Yehoshua bin Nun. So there's a view that says his father's name was not Nun. Nun is the letter that represents the number 50 in Judaism. And 50 represents the 50 gates of understanding that a person could achieve. So bin Nun means that this is somebody who reached the point of absolute understanding of Torah. Okay? So by the same token, over here, when we meet the rabbi of this Mishnah, some will tell you that the word that's associated with him is not his father's name. It's a trait about him. And that's why the ben is in parentheses. Okay? Ibn, that's a good question. Ibn is more like a Spanish expression of Ben. So Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, son of Ezra. But that would be more literal. That would literally mean that that's the person who's the son of so-and-so. Okay, so who do we meet in this Mishnah? We meet a rabbi called Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma. Now the ben is in parentheses, so many versions of this Mishnah actually read it as Rabbi Eliezer Chisma. Okay? Now, what does Chisma mean? It will help us to understand what it is that the Mishnah wants to convey about him, right? There's something about him, something about his nature, something about his history that is illustrated by this word, Chisma. So if you have a look in Hebrew, the word is spelled, I'll put it on the screen so that you can actually see it. Put the Mishnah. So the word Chisma is from the root Ches Samech Mem. Ches Samech Mem. Okay, what is that exactly? What does that mean? So it means a muzzle. Ches Samech Mem is a muzzle. For example, the Torah tells us, Loi Sachsoim Shor Bedishoy, that we are not allowed to muzzle an ox while it is plowing in the field, because that's considered like cruelty. Here's the ox working in the field and doing its job, surrounded by food, and you're not going to let it eat. It's considered to be a form of cruelty, and so we're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to muzzle the ox. Now here's the question. The question is, what does it mean when you muzzle a person? Yeah, certain people maybe need a mazel. And I don't mean it in the Jewish sense, like mazel tov. Some people need a mazel, they need some kind of a filter. Because what comes out of their mouth is not necessarily what should come out of somebody's mouth. However, in the case of Rabbi Eliezer, the story behind how he got this name, there's two versions of the story the Gemara brings. It's because he felt that he was muzzled. What happened? In the one version of the story, Rabbi Eliezer was approached by somebody who had a question in halacha. Now, we don't know at that stage exactly what phase, age, learning ability Rabbi Eliezer was. But he was approached by somebody who asked a particular halachic question, and he did not have the answer. And he felt very guilty of the fact that he didn't have the answer. So what he did was, he decided after that he's going to dedicate himself to be a student, and he's going to learn Torah. And his teacher was none other than the famous Rabbi Akiva. One version of the story. The other version of the story is that they asked him to lead the davening in shul. And he got up, and he wasn't familiar with how you lead the davening. He wasn't familiar with, which parts do you repeat, which parts do you say aloud, which parts say quietly. And he was very self-conscious over that because he felt he was muzzled. He felt that he couldn't speak. So that motivated him that he had to go back to school. And he went to Rabbi Akiva, and he studied. So then he got the nickname Rabbi Eliezer Chisma. Rabbi Eliezer, who started his journey from having been muzzled. Right? He couldn't talk, he didn't know the halacha, or he didn't know how to daven, as the case might be. And that's actually what prompted him that he should go on and he should learn Torah, and so therefore the nickname stuck. Doesn't sound so great, hey? Don't you think? Sounds a little bit, a little bit disdainful. Here you got a person who becomes one of these great rabbis, and how do we refer to him? We always refer to his early failings. Not really fair. Imagine that would be like calling somebody like Rabbi Akiva the ignorant, because that's how he started. Or calling Reish Lakish the highway robber, because that's how he started. Something doesn't sound right. And so the commentaries point out that what happened was Rabbi Eliezer went on to become such a great scholar who was so sharp, who was so knowledgeable, that when he used to speak, nobody else felt qualified to speak. So everybody else felt like they were muzzled. That's why they kept the nickname Rabbi Eliezer Chisma, because the implication was not just that, okay, he started off his journey at one point in time and he was like really, so to speak, all over the place, and he didn't have the grounding, but look what he turned into. That's much more important. He turned into somebody who could silence the crowd with his brilliance. Rabbi Eliezer Chisma. Rabbi Eliezer was a brilliant mind. So much so that the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Eliezer worked out a formula whereby he could calculate how many drops of water are there in the ocean. Okay? Can you imagine such a thing? That was seen as his brilliance, that he could work out that kind of information and detail about how the world works. Now, you might think that that's just, okay, it's an anecdote, it's an interesting thing. It's obviously a brilliant mind. To be perfectly honest, I don't know if there's anybody of you who has a use for that information, right? And I don't know if they said drops in the ocean because that was the language they were familiar with, and maybe he actually understood how many molecules there were in the ocean. I don't know. But what's the relevance to us? Why is that important for us to know? That will become evident a little bit later as we start to unpack the details of this Mishnah. This Mishnah, what he refers to in this Mishnah is some of, on the one hand, the most obscure laws in Judaism, and on the other hand, the most common laws in Judaism. That's the first part of the Mishnah. There's basically two parts to the Mishnah. So he discusses two different areas of study within Judaism, and he says that both of these are critical to the what he calls the halacha, the real study of halacha of Judaism. And then in the second part of the Mishnah, he's going to raise two other topics, and he's going to say those are the nice to haves in Judaism. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the connection between the two? And why is this information relevant to us anyway? What's the difference? If one part of the Torah is what he calls fundamental, and another part of the Torah is what he calls dessert. Why is that relevant to us? So let's have a look what he says. Rabbi Eliezer Chisma Oimer, Rabbi Eliezer Chisma says, Kinin upischei nida Hein gufei halachos. You know what's beautiful sometimes about Mishnah language? Sometimes you see it more clearly than other times. It's always the case. It's just that sometimes you see it more clearly. Is how every single word is so carefully chosen. So kinin, which we'll talk about in a second, is one area of Jewish law. Pirkei Nida is another area of Jewish law. He says, hein gufei halachos. These two areas, they are the very essence, the body of Jewish law. Gufei halachos, the body of Jewish law. So you have to ask yourself, why does he say hein? They are. He could have just said hein once. Why does he say hein? Okay, one of the things that we have to examine. So the first part of the Mishnah is he identifies two areas of Jewish law that he says that's the meat and bones, that's the thick of Jewish law. Then he tells us to kufois v'gematrios, two other areas of wisdom, parperois lachochma. Those are the condiments. Those are the appetizers. Or if you want, you could say the other way around. Those are the dessert of Torah. So obviously the first thing that we have to do in order to understand this Mishnah is we have to understand what are kinin, what are Pirkei Nida, what are tukufois, and what are gematrias. Because until we know what that is, we cannot even have a conversation to understand what Rabbi Eliezer wants to teach us. Now, I know straight away that there are two out of the four that I'm sure you feel, I know what that means. So let's start with the easy ones first. We'll start with the easiest of the lot, gematria. Gematria, which by the way, the name gematria, listen to the name, gematria. Can you hear anything in that name that sounds like anything that we do in the outside of the Jewish world? Any kind of science outside of I'll say it again, gematria. Anything that comes to mind at all, right? Anything, any science, any area of science that sounds in any way like gematria is what? Geometry, right? So it's no accident. Quite a number of the commentaries immediately point that out. And they say that gematria is the understanding of how numbers work. And that includes geometry, understanding how numbers work, understanding how angles work. Interesting, right? In fact, gematria is not even a Hebrew word, and it's not of Jewish origin. You can hear gematria. You can hear that it sounds actually Aramaic, and some will tell you that it's actually of Latin origin. Gematria. I'm saying some of the commentaries on the Mishnah will say it's of Latin origin. What is gematria in a Torah context? So we know because everybody loves to hear an interesting gematria. What's gematria? It's the fact that every letter in the Hebrew language has a numerical value. Aleph is 1 and Beis is 2 until you get to Yud, which is 10. Then it goes up in tens. Chof is 20. Lamed is 30 until you get to 100 Kuf, and then it goes up in hundreds. Reish is 200. Shin is 300. And then at the end, when we get to thousands, either we just put letters together like Tov, Reish would be 1,000. Or you just take an aleph and you put a little apostrophe next to it, and that becomes an aleph. Either way, that becomes 1,000. Either way, we know that letters in Torah have numerical value, and therefore there are all kinds of intriguing things that we could learn out of the letters because of their gematria value. So now, the study of gematria, at the end of the day, first of all, you've got to be very careful with gematria. People come up with all kinds of mashuga gematrias. I'm sure you remember, right? Over the course of the last few years, politically, there were all kinds of people who came up with all kinds of gematrias about Trump and about Biden and about who knows what. You know, all these, okay, that's not Torah. That's the stuff you can reserve for Purim. You play around with some letters and some numbers and, kind of make a mashup of all those things. But we do know that in genuine, authentic Judaism, gematria certainly does play a role, even to the point that sometimes we derive halacha out of gematria. Did you know that? There are certain halachic concepts that we derive out of gematria. Fascinating, isn't it? Here's one example. One example is that it says, when it talks about how Aaron is supposed to go and perform in the Beis HaMikdash, so it says that on Yom Kippur, it says he has to come ki b'yom hazeh. Okay? Sorry, not b'yom hazeh. That's another pasuk. But it says, bezeh, he has to come into the Beis HaMikdash with zeh. So they work out, Zeh has the gematria, Zayin is he has to come Be with Zeh. Zayin is 7, Hey is 5. From this we learn that there are 12 loaves that are supposed to be included in the Lechem Aponim, in the bread that is brought inside the Beis HaMikdash every single week, every single Shabbos. That's a practical law in Judaism that is derived out of the gematria of a word. We also know that certain fundamental chapters of Jewish history are alluded to in gematria. For example, it says when the Jewish people were going to come down to Egypt originally on Yosef's invitation, so Yosef says, go tell your father, go tell Yaakov, Redu, come down to Egypt. Redu has the gematria of 210, and that landed up being the amount of years that the Jews were in Egypt. And so on and so forth. There are many, many very intriguing gematrias that not only tell us, like a nice little vort that you could share at your Shabbos table, and everyone goes, oh, that's interesting, but that actually teach us fundamental principles within Judaism. If you've ever studied the work of Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim, so the Baal HaTurim, who is most famous for his book called the Arba Turim, which is the 4 basic areas of Jewish law that became the foundation of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. In addition to that, there's the Baal HaTurim commentary on the Chumash. A lot of his commentary is based on gematria, and it's beautiful stuff. You look in the pasuk, and he tells us this has the gematria of that, and he gives you these incredible insights. So it's an entire area of study within Judaism. That's gematria. Okay, that's probably the one that I think was most familiar, perhaps, to everybody. Because even though the second one we're going to look at has a familiar element to it, it also has a word to it which might confuse everybody. Pirkei Nida. So we understand what Nida is. Nida is a whole series of halachas that impact a married couple based on a woman's cycle. But Pirkei Nida, what does that mean? Pirkei means like the opening of Nida. What exactly does that mean? So we live in a simpler time in history in terms of these halachas, because the entire question of purity and impurity in today's world as regards a nida is only the question of the relationship between the husband and wife. Back in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there were other considerations, because in other areas of purity and impurity that could be impacted, there were all kinds of calculations that you had to make. For example, if a person could eat truma, if they could sit in certain places, go into certain places, the Beis HaMikdash, etc., etc. So it was a far more complex series of calculations that a person had to work out in order to determine the halachas of nida. Now, Pirkei Nida is a scenario where a woman lands up in a question as to whether or not she's due. Again, in today's world, it's very simple. Go to a mikveh, on average, whatever it works out to be once a month. In those days, a person may have had to go, may under certain circumstances, have had to go to the mikveh multiple times in a relatively short period of time because of the laws of the Beis HaMikdash, etc. Pirkei Nida are all the complicated queries about unusual circumstances where a person may have to go to the mikveh multiple times in short order. And the only reason that the person would have to go to the mikveh multiple times would be because they were unsure of the details of exactly where they were holding in terms of what's called zava and nida. I don't want to get overly complex, but it's different types of cycles. Basically, you should get the picture that Pirkei Nida refers to a very involved, complex area of Jewish law, but one that impacts people's lives on a regular basis, or at least it did in those days. So gematria and Pirkei Nida are almost like opposites. Gematria is fun stuff, Oh, did you hear this word? And did you see the value of that word and how it relates to this word, and so on and so forth. Pirkei Nida is very complex halacha with very significant impact on people's lives. Very different areas of law. Okay, so those are the two. That's almost like a clue as to the two categories we're going to be looking at. Now we've got to understand what the other two are. Kinin and Tekufos. So again, we'll start with the easier one. Let's start with Tekufos. Tekufos, the commentaries tell us, comes from the word hekef, which means orbit. And so therefore, Tekufos are the astronomical calculations to work out when you're going to see the new moon, when it's going to be Rosh Chodesh, when it's going to be the summer solstice, so that you know how to define if Pesach is going to be in the correct time or not in the correct time. If it's not going to be in the correct time, you have to make what's called a Shana Mu'uberes. Has to be a leap year, as this year coming, please God, so that you can catch up, so that the Tekufa does not fall out in the wrong time vis-a-vis Pesach. Tekufa over there referring to the summer solstice. It's where you work out when you're supposed to say certain prayers, like we're saying Talomata, when we start to pray for rain, which has to do with the winter solstice. So that's Tekufa, all the astronomical calculations that have a bearing on Torah law. So what do you see as Tekufa and Gematrias having in common? They're both number studies that you have to do within Judaism. Neither one of them is in itself Torah study. They just aid Torah study. See that? So, to know the astronomy of how to work out when the new moon is going to be is not an area of Torah, it's astronomy. And you don't even have to be Jewish to do it. The Rambam says something so interesting. He says, when he discusses the laws of exactly this, Kiddush HaChodesh, how you identify when you're going to sanctify the new moon and when you're going to announce Rosh Chodesh, as they used to do in those days, right? Nowadays, it's simple for us. We just download a calendar online. You probably already have a Jewish calendar built into your phone. So you don't have to work out when Rosh Chodesh is. You just have a look, and that's it. Tell you when Rosh Chodesh is. But in those days, in the time of the temple, you had to wait until you saw the new moon. And only then could you announce, today is Rosh Chodesh. And if nobody came to see the new moon, then by default, tomorrow has to be Rosh Chodesh, because you can't have a month that is longer than 30 days. Now, when those witnesses would come to present themselves, say, we saw the new moon, we have to know if they're telling the truth or not. So we had to understand, as the Sanhedrin, they had to understand the astronomy of it. Is it viable that this is a new moon? So this is the fascinating thing that the Rambam says. He says all of the works that he shares about how to make these calculations are all from Greek sources. Why from Greek sources? Because he says we used to have literature from the tribe of Yisachar. Apparently this was their area of expertise. So we used to have literature from them, and that literature got lost over time. But here's the word. Because astronomy is science. It's not opinion. It's not ideology, it's not theology, it's science. It really makes no difference who teaches it, because it's factual and it can be proven empirically. So it's not Torah. Tekufos is not Torah, it's science. It is science that we use in order to learn Torah. That's why it's called dessert. That's why it's called the condiments. It's not the real thing. Likewise with gematria, the mathematics that you use to calculate this letter equals that, and the other letter, that is not Torah itself. You'll use your calculations and apply it to Torah. That's fine. But the actual study of the mathematics is not Torah. So those two, they belong to the so-called dessert. Pischei Nida is real Torah. Now you're trying to calculate what is the halacha in this particular case. How is it going to apply realistically to this particular person? Does she have to go to the mikveh again? That is real Torah. And the final, what's actually the first on the list, but we've left it to last because it's the one we know the least about, is called kinin. Kinin comes from the word kain. A kain is a nest. The halachas that are associated with birds. Did you know that there's a whole area of Jewish law that is associated with birds? Now, I know what you're thinking, and you wouldn't be mistaken for thinking this, especially considering which parasha we just read this past Shabbos. You're thinking, I know which halacha is birds. That's the halacha that if you happen upon a nest and you want to take the eggs or the babies, you now have a mitzvah to chase away the mother bird before you take the young. That's it. That's the law of birds, right? Such a fascinating thing happened this past week. So that piece of the parasha was in the if you divide the parasha up according to the days of the week, because it's got 7 portions. So that piece about chasing the mother bird was in Monday's reading, last Monday. Someone from our community on last Monday happened on a nest and landed up chasing away the mother bird. He was so thrilled at the opportunity to do the mitzvah. He came to shul for mincha that afternoon, sat down, opened up the Chumash to read that day's portion, and discovered that it was in that day's portion. I cannot tell you how exhilarated this person was. Not only to do the mitzvah, to do the mitzvah on that day. But that's not kinin. That is not what Rabbi Elazar Chisma is referring to over here when he says that there are these laws of kinin. So what is kinin? There are certain sacrifices that come from birds. Most sacrifices are animal sacrifices, sheep, goats, even bulls. There are certain that come from birds. Who brings a bird as an offering? So it could be a person has to purify themselves from tzoras. It would be a woman after childbirth, or a person could make a donation that they want to donate a bird to the Beis HaMikdash. There is an entire segment of the Talmud, an entire section of Mishnah dedicated to the laws of these birds. Why? Because generally speaking, you would use either a Torah or a goizel, which basically what you would use is either you would use a pigeon or you would use a dove. Those are the two kinds of birds. Now, the whole halachic discussion is, what happens if a person took two birds, dedicated one of them to be one kind of a sacrifice called the oila offering, one to be the sacrifice called the chatas offering, sin offering. Now, there are certain circumstances where one person is required by Torah to bring both. Now the birds got mixed up. Now what do? Because the procedure of the sin offering and the procedure of the oila offering are totally different. So now what do? Pages and pages of laws, of scenarios, of how the birds could be confused and how you could resolve it. What happens if you had, let's say, a whole group of birds in an enclosure? One bird you take out and you say, this is going to be the sacrifice. Then it goes back into the enclosure. Now it's lost in the crowd. Now what? Because by law, anything that's dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash cannot be used for private use. Now, I don't know which one. Pages and pages of laws. Very complex, very detailed, tremendous amount of conversation around it. Says Rabbi Eliezer Chisma, this is real learning. Getting into this kind of detail to work out those issues, that is real learning. Okay? So now, we've got to ask ourselves, what is it that he's trying to convey by telling us that there are two types of laws that are examples of the gufei halachos, like the meat and bones of Torah, and there are two areas of wisdom that are more like the dessert of Torah. Let's try and understand what's going on over here. And you'll notice straight away, as we go through this, you'll notice a few very interesting things. Number one, Rabbi Eliezer Chisma lived after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, after the destruction of the temple, which means that he lived in a period of history where you could not bring sacrifices. Even if you were obligated and even if you wanted to. You couldn't. It was illegal. As it is today. You cannot bring a sacrifice without the Beis HaMikdash. So the first item that he puts on the list, kinim, is number one, a very complex area of Jewish law, and number two, one that is not relevant in his lifetime. What's his message? His message is there are two kinds of law in Judaism. There is kinim and there's Pirkei Avos. Kinim is an area of law that happened rarely. The amount of people who would ever have tzoras is a small number of people. Even the kinim, the birds that a person brings after childbirth, how many times in a person's life will they ever bring that sacrifice? And of course, no man will ever bring it. So it's a rare scenario. Not only is it a rare scenario, it's a complicated scenario. There are so many laws that come into play. Not only is it rare and complicated, Rabbi Eliezer Chisma is living at a time when the Beis HaMikdash doesn't even exist. So it's not even applicable. He says that's one area of law. As I'm sure many people will tell you, and sometimes even with a tinge of frustration in their voice, there are many, many areas of Torah that feel like they're not relevant to us in our generation. For example, if you had to learn the Shulchan Aruch, great. So the Shulchan Aruch speaks about things that are applicable today. If you had to learn the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, or for that matter the Gemara, you will find volumes of information that you feel, but why am I learning this? It doesn't apply to me. That's kinim. That's what kinim represent. The areas of law that are involved, but not practical for us right now. On the other hand, Pirkei Nida. Pirkei Nida, all the intricacies of the laws of Nida are just as complex, Not only are they just as complex, the truth of the matter is that they require very focused attention and great expertise. So, what happens in the Pirkei Nida reality? It's complex, it's involved, but unlike Kinim, it's highly common. Every single family has to deal with the laws of Nida, and on a regular basis. That's what Rabbi Eliezer Chisma wants to tell us. There are two areas of Jewish law. One area of Jewish law is very involved. That means it's going to be intellectually taxing, but is not current. The other area of Jewish law is equally challenging intellectually and is very much part of our lives. You would think I should prioritize the parts of Torah that are relevant over the parts of Torah that are theoretical. Therefore, he tells us, Hein gufei halachos. That's why he uses the double expression. Hein means that both of these have equal value as the body of Torah. Judaism is not an academic pursuit for practical reasons only. Judaism is to learn Torah because it's Hashem's Torah. And the goal of learning Torah is, as we say, lishma, for its sake. The reason why we should learn Torah is because Hashem said so. How will you ensure that you learn Torah because Hashem said so? How? By learning areas that are not practical right now with the same commitment as the areas that impact your life every single day. That's his message. Hein gufei halachos. Both of these are the essence, the body, the real, so to speak, muscle of Torah. But he's actually quite specific in his choice, because both Kinim and Pirkei Nida have one thing in common, and that is that all the complexities of their laws all center on issues of doubt. In other words, the laws of Kinim are actually quite straightforward. In this scenario, you bring these birds. In that scenario, you bring those birds. The laws of Nida are quite straightforward. In this scenario, you go to the mikveh. In that scenario, you don't have to go to the mikveh. When do things become complicated? Only when there is a doubt. I don't know what happened to the bird. I don't know what happened if I'm due to go to the mikveh or not. So the entire nature of both of these midas and both of these areas of law and what they have in common is that they're both founded on doubt. You might argue, listen, if something is doubt-based, the only reason I'm having this discussion, the only reason I'm exploring these laws is because I don't know the facts. You'd think that should maybe be less important in Torah than things where you do know the facts. That's what you'd think. So let's rather prioritize things that are clear and so to speak, easy to understand. So therefore he says, Hein gufei halachos. You need to understand that as far as Judaism is concerned, even when you deal with something that is completely founded on a doubt, on uncertainty, that is real Torah, as opposed to astronomy and gematria, which are founded on certainty. Astronomy is empirical. This is definitely the case. That nothing's going to change. This is the cycle of the moon. This is how it's going to operate every 29 and a half days. This is how it's going to operate over the full 19-year cycle of the lunar experience. That's it. It is absolutely 100% predictable. And yet, that's only considered dessert. That's what he's teaching us over here. There are areas of Torah that maybe you won't have absolute clarity, but because they're actual Torah, that's where the real value lies. Whereas there might be areas of life where the wisdom is so clear and absolute, and it doesn't have the value of real Torah, which is, of course, quite a powerful thing to consider. And it's very interesting. The Gemara says at the end of Kinim, so Kinim is that whole section about all the birds, it says the following statement. It's quite a powerful statement. It says the nature of people, excuse me, I hope nobody is offended by this. The nature of people is that as they get older, so their minds start to erode. That's how it is. But those, says the Gemara, those people who learn Torah, As they age, so they become wiser. That's what he's teaching us over here. Kinim, the Gemara says that about kinim. Why? Because kinim, those parts of Torah that don't necessarily have a practical application in our reality, and that are highly complicated, and that you could argue, yes, but the whole thing is only based on a question, and we don't even know if the question is even relevant. That is the part of Torah that actually makes a person wiser. That's the part of the Torah, besides the obvious that you're doing what Hashem wants, but actually has benefit for you. And that's why he says they are gufei halacha. These are core elements of halacha. He does not say gufei Torah, just generically, that this is the essence or the meat of the Torah learning experience. He specifically says halacha. Why? For two reasons. First of all, he wants to tell us that one of the most important things that a Jewish person can ever do is to learn with a focus on what the halacha is, what the practical application is, even if the practical application is not today. But there's a far more powerful lesson over here. Halacha comes from the root Hey Lamed Chof, which is the root for progress. Right? Hoylech means to walk, but it means specifically to progress. As the famous prophecy of Zechariah, where he says that angels are oindim, angels are static, and humans, specifically Jewish people, are mahalchim. We have the capacity to constantly progress. Hein gufei halachos. What is the essence? What is the body of spiritual progress? How does a person really, really move? How does a person really grow in their Yiddishkeit, in their connection to Hashem? How? Through learning both that which is absolutely relevant and that which you could argue has no impact on my life today. You learn both of those. That's halacha. That's how you grow in your Torah. So that's the one side of the conversation. Then he talks about the other side of the conversation. He talks about tekufos and gematrios. Now, Rabbi Eliezer Chisma, obviously, you understand why he had an interest in these things, tekufos and gematrios, because at the end of the day, we said earlier on that Rabbi Eliezer Chisma came up with a formula to calculate how many drops of water there are in the ocean. That tells you that this is somebody who really loves numbers. He loves maths. He loves science. So you would expect somebody like him to say, tekufos and gematrios, astronomy and maths, you would expect him to say, that's the ultimate, because look at him, that's the kind of person that he is, right? That's what you'd expect. What does he say? The exact opposite. He says, those are the parparois. Now, there are two ways that you could translate parparois. The one is dessert, and the other is the appetizers. So he says it's the appetizers. Why? He says, because the nature of, if you're that way inclined, the nature of number problems or number exercises, be they mathematical, be they geometry, be they scientific, is that they whet your appetite for more. Think about it. If you calculate something and it really makes sense, you think, wow, that's brilliant. Okay, let's do this again. Let's see how it applies somewhere else. Let's see how this formula applies somewhere else. So he says it's parparois lechachma. You have two choices in life. You could believe that science is the be-all and end-all. You could believe that mathematics is the be-all and end-all, and you'd be missing the point completely. What it really is supposed to be is a way of stimulating your appetite to say, so what else is there? What else besides this brilliant science is there? Somebody sent me a thing yesterday. I thought it was so clever. They said, why would you wish upon a star if you could rather pray to the one who created them? Tekufos and gematrios. Why would you just only satisfy yourself with the brilliance of the world that we live in and not use that as a springboard to draw you closer to the one who made that world and created this beautiful nature? That's what he's telling us over here. Tekufos v'gematrios, all of the scientific knowledge in the world can only be to stimulate an appetite. On the other hand, and yes, I'm sure every one of us as a child who has debated this particular subject with us, you cannot live on dessert. Right? Cannot live on dessert. You actually have to have the main course. And that's really what Rabbi Eliezer Chisma wants us to know. He says, these things are beautiful, they're amazing, they're going to really excite you. Gematria, you can say gematria from here till who knows where. And you can spend all your time doing the astronomy, etc. But at the end of the day, you cannot live just on dessert. You have to have gufei halacha. You have to have the real meat and bones. You actually have to invest your time and your effort in really connecting with Hashem through His great wisdom. Right, I was waiting for somebody to say this. I was waiting for somebody to point out the word parparois is like the word parpar in Hebrew, which is a butterfly, right? Fleeting, like they used to have on social media. They used to have these fleets, short messages that just disappear over time. And that's exactly the point. Very great, very exciting. It's not necessarily going to make you a better person. Here's one last beautiful insight. Why do you think the Gemara wanted us to know that Rabbi Eliezer Chisma could calculate how many drops there are in the ocean? Really, I think it's amazing. Put on your CV. I'm sure when they introduced him, when he was going to speak, they said, this is him. This is the rabbi who knows how many. But seriously speaking, this is the Gemara. We're talking about the Mishnah. We're talking about this is Torah. We're not interested in creating trivial credentials for people. It obviously must have some significance. So we've got to work out what that significance is. What is the significance of saying, I know how many drops there are in the ocean? Why? You're a great rabbi. Why would you care how many drops there are in the ocean? So let's rephrase for a second what Rabbi Eliezer Chisma is really saying. Rabbi Eliezer Chisma says, if you look out at the ocean, as a human being, you look out at the ocean, what do you see? You don't see drops. You see the big generalized ocean. You don't see the individual drops. And therefore, you get the impression that what is important, the collective. The individual drop is not so significant. The main thing is there's an ocean, right? Nobody goes and sits on the beach and thinks, oh, beautiful, look at all the drops. You don't. You look at the whole scenery. Rabbi Eliezer Chisma says, as a Jewish person, the real wisdom of Judaism is you realize that every single drop within the ocean has significance. The fact that Hashem designed the world, that the ocean should be comprised of drops, that each drop should be comprised of molecules, He could have created the world in any which way He wanted. He could have created the world that the entire ocean would be one singular organism of water. Could have. Why did He design it that every drop comprises the ocean? To teach us that every detail is significant. Says Rabbi Eliezer Chisma, that's exactly how Torah works. Every detail is significant. You're going to say it's just a gematria. You're going to say it's kinnim, it's these abstract laws, and the whole issue is only because somebody wasn't paying attention, and so now they've got a big question mark, what actually happened. You might think that those things are not so relevant, because there's a bigger picture, right? How often do you hear people say this? There's a bigger picture. I'm sure that God doesn't care about this detail or that detail. He cares generally that I'm a mensch, that I have a good heart, or whatever the case is. Says Rabbi Eliezer Chisma, every drop is significant. Every component has a role to play. Every part of the Torah, including those parts that are only dessert, even those parts that are only doubts that we have to resolve, even those parts that you might sweep away and say they're not relevant right now, every single part represents and makes the whole of the Torah complete. By extension, you could probably say the same thing about every single person too. Somebody who is willing to recognize the value of the detail within Torah is more likely to realize the value of the person within the community. And the person who says, no, it's all about the high level, overall, generalized purpose, unfortunately, is probably likely to see people that way too. And that's quite an important message. Nice way to end off the chapter, saying everything that we have learned over here, you may, at the end of this chapter or the end of any chapter, say that part was more important, that part was less important. This part spoke to me, this part didn't speak to me. Comes on Rabbi Eliezer Chisma and says every single detail is relevant. If you don't have the detail, you don't have the tapestry that Hashem wants you to create.